Hey guys, I'm Andy Kristoff and this is Pathbend, where we explore how to reconnect with ourselves, rebuild trust in our relationships, and reclaim our authentic purpose. Last time, we talked about the attachment behavioral system and how deeply impactful it is across virtually all areas of our social lives. Today, I want to take a stab at answering the question, what does it take to repattern that system? So this episode is especially designed for the ones among us who are insecurely attached, though I think everyone will find something useful in it. And I'll start with a simple idea. The idea is that your attachment style, whether secure or insecure, developed in much the same way your native language did. And assuming you're somewhere on the anxious or avoidant side of the spectrum, or perhaps both if you're fearful avoidant, then the language you grew up speaking, your native tongue, is not the language of love and connection. If you stop to think about it, this idea also has one very intriguing corollary, which I'd like to use as the foundation of today's discussion. That earning security, in other words, the process of learning to develop and sustain true intimacy in your relationships, is like learning a second language as a grown-up. And the more I turn this idea over in my head, the more I realize how powerful it could be as a mental model that makes the journey to healing our attachment wounds easier to navigate. And as we start pulling on this thread, what starts unraveling is a surprisingly nuanced picture of the healing process. How long it actually takes, what makes it harder than most people expect, what can speed up our progress and what gets in the way, and ultimately what becomes possible when we're on the other side. So today I want to put on my linguistics hat and really tease out the implications of this second language metaphor. Probably because as a non-native English speaker and a former language teacher, I started seeing so many fascinating parallels in it. But I also want to be mindful of where it breaks down, because as valuable as analogies are, they're never perfect. And overstretching this one could become misleading. Having said all this, my invitation to you is not to worry so much about whether this metaphor is perfectly accurate, but whether it's useful. Because sometimes the simplest ideas are the ones that unlock the heaviest doors. So if you've ever felt you were just bad at relationships or that intimacy was somehow not in the cards for you, I hope this episode will convince you otherwise. Before I go any further, I want to make a quick caveat. Today's discussion will lean more on the literary and interpretive side of things, and that's very much on purpose. So what I'll share next is a deliberate simplification, the kind that strips away the particular to reveal the structural and universal. So even if it doesn't capture your exact story, it delineates the bearings, the shape and contours underneath it. So when I speak about insecure attachment styles, please don't read this as a suggestion that your parents were terrible people or did terrible things. The vast majority of parents did their absolute best with the resources they had. And the vast majority love their children dearly. But when it comes to human relationships of any sort, it's important to separate intention from impact. As I've highlighted in previous videos, what gets encoded in the nervous system isn't necessarily the love the parents consciously strive to give, but the felt experience, the felt pattern the child lived on a day-to-day basis. And in many families, the dominant pattern, however unintentional that was not that of secure connection and safe emotional expression. Now, with this in mind, let's start from the beginning. If you fall somewhere on the insecure end of the attachment spectrum, you grew up in a kingdom of lights and shadows. A kingdom where some version of harsh, inconsistent, neglectful, or frightening caregiving reigned. The native tongue in that kingdom wasn't the language of love and connection. It was the language of fear and self-protection. There was a peculiar vocabulary you had to master, And the grammar rules were some variation on one or more of the following themes. That love was contingent on your performance, that emotions were intolerable and must be suppressed, that people couldn't be trusted, that in order to stay safe, you must draw attention to yourself or away from yourself, that you must constantly read the room and stay alert for the tiniest shift in emotional weather. In that kingdom, the coin of the realm wasn't love, though love might have been transacted on the side too. The primary currency was behaviors that helped you get your needs met with as little exposure as possible and avoid getting hurt by the people closest to you. Because you learned to expect, even if it was subconscious, that sooner or later you would get hurt. So rather than becoming fluent in the language of intimate connection, you became fluent in a different one. The language of self-protection. The language of control and one-upmanship. The language of emotional management, of hypervigilance, of withdrawal, of outbursts of anger, of preemptive retreat. You didn't choose that language, you were raised in it, and that became your native tongue. Before we get to explore all the fascinating implications of this metaphor, I want to make one key distinction to anchor the discussion. It's the distinction between language acquisition and language learning. Kids don't learn their native language, they acquire it. Acquisition is an organic and precognitive process. It happens through sheer immersion and repeat exposure, without conscious effort, instruction, or grammar books. And by the time the child is old enough to start really thinking about language and learning the alphabet, their native tongue is already fully available. By contrast, learning a second language as an adult is a different process. It's deliberate, effortful, reflective. You're consciously trying to build new patterns, using your first language as a springboard, but also trying to overcome its gravitational pull. In essence, you're trying to unlearn certain default ways of constructing sentences and structuring your thought. The brain is less plastic in adulthood, which means the process is slower, takes more intentional effort, and requires something acquisition never did: sustained, structured practice over long stretches of time. So this is the frame. Earning security in adulthood is less like acquiring a first language and more like learning a second one as a grown-up. All the implications I'll share next flow directly from this distinction. The first implication is foundational and easy to miss. Since your attachment patterns were acquired rather than learned, they're largely invisible to you by default. And what's even more profound is that they're not even accessible to conscious thought. A fish doesn't think about the water it swims in. The water is simply the medium of its existence. It's only when you pull the fish out of the tank that the water leaps to conscious awareness. Only then does it become something you can point to and examine. Now take this idea and map it onto your native attachment style. By default, you don't think of the way you show up in relationships as a set of strategies or defenses. You experience them as how you are, how relationships work, what love and connection are supposed to feel like. This is why learning about these patterns, while necessary, is not sufficient on its own. You can read every book on attachment theory and still find yourself enacting the same pattern in real time, in real relationships, because the pattern lives much deeper than the thinking mind. So what might come as a surprise here is that these attachment patterns aren't transmitted consciously but procedurally. To go back to parenting as an example, many insecure parents read books on effective child rearing. And yet studies show that this has very little influence on their ability to disrupt the insecure pattern so as not to pass it on to their children. So what can we take away from this? Well, the first step on the journey to healing insecure patterns isn't to dive straight into learning a new language, but to become fully conscious of the native one you've been speaking all along. The second implication is about the timeline, specifically how long the process takes and what shapes that healing arc. Here, the parallel to language learning is really powerful and insightful, because no one expects realistically that you can become fluent in a new language after a few weeks of flipping through your flashcards. We accept without judgment that real fluency takes time. It takes usually years of sustained effort and interaction, though we can make massive progress for sure in as little as a few months. Equally as important, we don't interpret slow progress as a character flaw, because we get it. We understand how complex and challenging the process of learning a new language actually is. But think about it, why is it so rare that we give ourselves the same kind of grace when it comes to attachment work? We expect to move the needle dramatically after a burst of therapy sessions or a coaching program. It's like doing a semester of Russian and being upset you can't understand War and Peace. Once we start seeing the arc more clearly, it becomes easier to be kinder and more compassionate with ourselves. What determines the timeline comes down to a few key variables. The first is the consistency and intensity of your effort. During undergrad, I studied Mandarin, and I remember when I went to Beijing for a few months, my progress shot through the roof. Fast forward to today, many years later, when I barely run into a Mandarin speaker every few months. At that pace, I'm not only not making progress, I'm not even maintaining. Sporadic effort generates sporadic results. This is true when it comes to language learning, and it's equally true here. The second variable is affinity, how close your native language sits relative to the language you're trying to learn. Are you like a French speaker who's trying to learn another Romance language like Italian? Or are you a French speaker trying to learn something completely unfamiliar like Inuit? A mildly anxious person learning to relate more securely is like a French speaker learning Italian. A person with a deeply disorganized attachment, on the other hand, is working with the wider gap. The distance makes a difference. The third variable has to do with individual differences. Some people simply learn languages faster than others. And in attachment work, what it often comes down to is our capacity to tolerate ambiguity and stay curious instead of defensive when something uncomfortable or unfamiliar comes up. The capacity to observe and reflect on your own and other people's mental states. These things help. But regardless of your starting position, the floor is the same for everyone. It's just not realistic to expect to become fluent in just a few weeks. The fourth and perhaps most important variable is exposure. Studying a language from a textbook and living in the country where it's spoken are totally different experiences. Immersion can compress the timeline substantially. To map this back to our discussion, being in a relationship, whether it's a therapeutic or a romantic one, can have a substantial positive impact. In a relationship, you don't always get to choose when to show up and when to practice. Ruptures and repairs happen in real time with high stakes, in a delicate dance with another person's emotions and nervous system patterns. When you're immersed in the environment, you have both clarity of purpose and a continuous two-way feedback loop. You'll probably realize that that kind of exposure can even become a double accelerant, because it can also serve as a motivator. The same way that studying French in a patisserie in downtown Paris is far more motivating than studying French over avocado toast in downtown San Francisco. One important caveat, though, is that immersion only helps if the environment you're in is actually speaking the language you're trying to learn. Similarly, in a relationship, if both partners are insecurely attached and unaware of their patterns, which is by far the most common scenario, the immersive environment may actually be reinforcing the very pattern you're trying to break. In other words, you get more practice of the same old language. this only deepens the grooves. Now, let's move on to the next big implication. If you've tried to learn a second language, you know that the process is not a straight line upward. Progress happens, but then you plateau. And sometimes you even feel like you're regressing. You feel like you've learned a bunch of words, but soon after you can't recall half of them. Or you get really comfortable with daily conversations when you're visiting the new country, but a few weeks after you get back home, you find yourself stumbling over sentences that once came naturally. There's a real neurological dimension to this because our neural circuits work on a use it or lose it basis. In other words, the new pathways you're building strengthen through repetition, but they also start weakening without it. The healing journey is nonlinear in a similar way. You might have started accumulating deep insight, started building new relational and emotional skills, developed the capacity to respond differently in situations that used to derail you. But when life hits hard, you might find yourself back in your old patterns. A relationship that ends, a period of isolation, stress at work, or conflict with a family member, and you start feeling as if the second language was something that happened to another person. The pathways are still there and can be reignited much faster than they were originally built, but we have to be mindful that regression is a natural feature of this biological process. The invitation here is for more patience, realism, and especially self-compassion. You're trying to rewire patterns your nervous system has built active, elaborate defenses to preserve. They were laid down in your first years of life and deeply grooved through decades of repetition. So the fact that the journey is nonlinear isn't a reflection of your commitment, but simply the nature of the terrain you're trying to traverse. But there's even more nuance to this story. The next implication accounts for a lot of the quiet suffering that happens in long-term relationships, which from the outside look like they're working. In linguistics, there's a phenomenon called fossilization. It describes what happens when a person reaches just enough proficiency to get by, and then they hit a ceiling they seem to not be able to break through. Why does that happen? Well, because they can handle virtually all the basic day-to-day interactions. They can order coffee, they can buy groceries, they can go to the movies. And because they can get by, the drive to keep learning and to keep making additional progress essentially disappears. This parallel actually gives us some interesting clues about attachment work too, because many insecurely attached people develop enough proficiency, enough relational vocabulary to enter and sustain a relationship. The conflicts become less explosive, the daily exchanges are livable and sometimes even pleasant. And then they spend years and sometimes even decades in relationships that are functional but not fully alive, not fully connected, where the two people express their needs indirectly or not at all, where intimacy is perpetually deferred, where the relationship itself ossifies into what Eric Berne calls games, series of predictable moves that lead to hidden emotional payoffs. It's these games themselves that stabilize the structure, that allow both partners to feel like they're getting their basic emotional needs met without ever being truly open, truly vulnerable, and truly seen. So we have a new distinction here between proficiency and mastery. Proficiency means you can function well in daily interactions. Mastery means you have access to the full range of the language. In relational terms, that means presence, vulnerability, emotional regulation, initiating repair after rupture, the capacity to reveal yourself fully, and to truly know and accept another person in all their human imperfection. Most people, if they embark on this journey at all, they stop at proficiency and limp along in relationships. But it's important to keep in mind the difference, that there is still a big distance to cross in the gap between one and the other. To use our language analogy, With proficiency, you can read the daily newspaper, and that's okay. With mastery, you can read all the great literary masterpieces in that new language. Take a second to appreciate the difference. How much richness and depth are you missing out on if you get stuck here perpetually? Next, let's look at another wrinkle our language analogy makes more obvious. Under high enough stress, even the most fluent non-native speaker loses some of their fluency. The accent comes back. In linguistics, this is called reverting to type, and it happens because speaking a second language, let's call that earned fluency, takes high-level conscious cognitive energy, which is depleted by stress. When the cognitive load and emotional load are high, the nervous system reaches for what's most familiar and most automatic, and the person who typically speaks without any trace of an accent suddenly sounds unmistakably foreign. Something similar happens in earned security too. You could have developed deep relational capacity through years of repatterning, and yet find yourself in the middle of a serious relationship rupture back in the old pattern. Withdrawing, clinging, shutting down, acting out, saying harsh things in the old language as if the new language wasn't accessible at all. As disappointing as this may seem in the moment, it's just evidence that the nervous system, under high enough pressure, defaults to its oldest and most practiced program. The native language is almost always faster, more reflexive, and more immediately available than the one you've learned later on. And even if that gap narrows over time, it'll probably take several decades of full immersion to fully close, if it ever closes at all. What matters more is what you do in the wake of such episodes, whether you can catch it. Noticing the accent coming up in your voice, taking a breath, and then finding your way back to the greater eloquence that's available to you in the new language. With the next implication, we'll touch on a debate that comes up often in attachment circles. Can you earn security on your own, or is being in a close relationship absolutely indispensable? Our language metaphor suggests that this is probably a false dichotomy. Can you study grammar and vocab alone? Yes. Similarly, can you develop insight into your patterns, build emotional regulation skills, and become more mindful on your own? Yes. It's ridiculous to say that that doesn't count as real progress. In fact, that's necessary work, and for some people it's a prerequisite. It's the groundwork that makes it possible to tolerate the activation of the attachment system and the triggers of a real relationship long enough to start accessing its transformative potential. Having said that, there's a point at which vocab drills without conversation become just a long list of words on a page. Language, like relationships, isn't a solo act. Secure partners and secure therapeutic relationships function as native speakers. They give you the immersive environment that gives you a chance to practice and eventually learn the new language. Here there's a complication though. Our insecure patterns tend to make us uncomfortable around people who relate securely. Why? Well, because that's actually not your native language. You hear this often. Secure connection can feel flat, low intensity, and even boring. Because it lacks the activation and the charge your nervous system has learned to associate with love. And so we gravitate toward the familiar dynamic, the volatile, dramatic, erratic relationships. The ones where we can go back to freely speaking our native language, but also where we run the risk of reopening and even deepening our wounds. This naturally leads us to the next important implication. The system will resist. I don't know if it's still true with the latest AI-driven translation apps, but until recently, every summer across Europe, there was a special kind of tourist you were almost guaranteed to run into. The American who gets off the plane and heads straight to McDonald's. He refuses to even try speaking the local language and instead speaks English more loudly. Moreover, he's convinced that everyone else should speak English back to him too. And deeper than the irritation, there's this stubborn insistence. I shouldn't have to change. What do you think is the real function of that attitude? Well, it's probably defensive self-protection. To try speaking the new language is to risk failing, to be exposed as a beginner. And some part of us would rather have us misunderstood on our own terms than vulnerable on someone else's. The more insecure the attachment strategies, the more resources the system recruits to defend its architecture. To phrase this differently, the deeper the relational wounds, the more elaborate and more rigid the defenses. Denial, projection, intellectualization, the subtle art of telling yourself convincing stories, too analytically sophisticated to actually change. Or to even notice you're defending ingrained patterns that are holding you back. Often the person who most needs to do the work is the one who has developed the most sophisticated reasons not to. That's the paradox of healing. And here's something else that's important about how insecure systems work. They don't just resist change passively. They actively recruit reality to confirm our native language. The anxious person finds evidence that people are unreliable. The avoidant finds evidence that closeness costs more than it's worth. The fearful avoidant finds evidence that love is dangerous and inevitably leads to betrayal. The system's always scanning for these things. And it's not scanning for truth, but confirmation. This is what I meant last time when I said that the system is designed for protection, not truth-seeking. Delving deep into attachment theory is a way to stare your pattern squarely in the eye and become aware of your predictable blind spots. This takes a little bit of courage, but more importantly, it makes courageous action possible. That said, courageous action in the face of what every fiber of your nervous system experiences as threat isn't a minor undertaking. In many ways, it's the entire undertaking. This is where I want to be transparent about the limits of this extended metaphor, and this might actually be the most practical point in this discussion. For all its difficulty, language learning is largely a cognitive process. With some deliberate effort and diligence, you can watch your progress stack up over time. Earning security is fundamentally different. The brunt of the relational language we're trying to unlearn and learn lives below the thinking mind. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the emotional imprints that were laid down in the first 3 years of life before you even had words. These aren't quite like cognitive biases you can correct for once you understand them intellectually, but survival responses encoded in the body's tissues, in the deep memory of what closeness felt like in your early environment. Below conscious awareness, the system expects that every new adult relationship would just be a repetition of the same pattern. And this makes it likely that when you get into one of those new relationships, you'll hit moments where the very instrument you're trying to learn new patterns with gets hijacked and taken offline by your old patterns in predictable ways. Under relational stress, anxious preoccupieds are often swept by the current of emotions. Avoidants deactivate and numb out. And fearful avoidants cycle through both, often in more extreme ways, hot one day and cold the next. So attachment activation doesn't just make learning harder. It can shut the entire classroom down. What happens is it pushes your nervous system outside your window of tolerance. Your body goes into fight, flight, or freeze. And in that state, all that insight about your attachment patterns essentially does nothing. This is why earning security requires something more than language learning does. Building the nervous system capacity to stay present when staying present might feel almost unbearable. For some of us, building that capacity alone is the precondition that makes sustaining a relationship possible. And now I have a small surprise for you. I want to share the implication I believe has the deepest impact in this entire metaphor. I want you to pause and think about your native language for a minute. Who do you speak it most often with? Here's the thing. Your native language isn't only something you speak with other people. Above all, it's the language of your internal monologue. Think about what that actually means. If you grew up in the kingdom of lights and shadows, speaking the language of self-protection, then that very language is the one you use to relate to yourself every single day. That's the language that says love is conditional, that your emotions are dangerous or unwanted or a weakness, that you must control other people and your circumstances, perform perfectly and stay alert to be safe. That language carries the voice that judges your worth, the voice that interprets your actions as failures, the voice that decides on an ongoing basis what you deserve and what you don't. This means that the intimacy you struggle to access in your relationships is the same intimacy you can't access within yourself. Self-trust is a conversation, self-compassion is a conversation, and if the only language available to you is the language of self-protection, those internal conversations will sound like negotiation at best and condemnation at worst. This is the deepest wound, and it reframes the entire project of earning security. Because we're not only learning to relate to others differently, we're learning to speak to ourselves in a different language. To offer ourselves the same warmth, the same kindness, the same presence, the same attunement, the same unconditional positive regard that fluency in the language of love and connection makes possible in our closest relationships. So now we can see the full picture. Now we can see that full fluency in the end means something far greater than having better relationships. It means fully connecting, perhaps for the first time, to yourself, your inherent worth, the depth of your inner life, your authentic needs and desires. And all of that in a language you don't have to wear a mask and a shield to speak. So I'll end on a hopeful note with something you can carry with you. The road through earned security is harder than the road a natively secure person walks. There's no shortcut, no magic bullet, no honest way around it. And as I mentioned, many people who start on this road eventually stop somewhere halfway, stuck in relationships that are functional but not truly fulfilling. But here's the prize for the people who stay on the road and keep walking. Someone who masters another language often understands its structure and complexity far better than a native speaker. Because they had to climb to a vantage point a native speaker never had a reason to visit. They know the grammar consciously, they can draw unique parallels to their native language. They know, in a way that fluency alone can't produce, how the language actually functions. The person who earns security brings all of that to their relationships. The incredible emotional attunement that was forged in hypervigilance, the capacity for staggering relational depth, and the ability to meet another person, whether it's a partner, a child, a friend, in a place of genuine connection and understanding. The moment one crosses over into fluency, even if that takes many years, is the moment when the wound fully heals. The moment when the scar becomes the star. As Sufi poet Rumi writes, The wound is the place where the light enters you. And now, finally, the work of moving through the wound reveals the kind of radiance that can now light the way for others. And the hope is that the generations that come after you may never have to make the crossing at all, because the language of love and connection you worked so hard to master, well, they may simply grow up speaking it.